Chapter 18 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Luke. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 18. George Washington. Ever since the Declaration of Independence, George Washington has been the greatest figure in the history of the United States of America, and it is certain that he will continue to be so for hundreds of years to come. In all history, there is no parallel to the dignity, the majesty, the mightiness of his achievement, and no other man who has built a monument of greatness so enduring as his. He was born in Virginia in 1732 on the 22nd of February. His father was Augustine Washington, and his mother was a second wife named Mary Ball. The Washingtons were prominent and influential people in Virginia, and had lived there for many years. In spite of this, not a great deal is known about Augustine Washington, although it is certain that he was an upright and honorable gentleman. But George's mother was famous for her good sense as well as her beauty. Her family was a large one. There had been children by the first wife also, and as Augustine Washington died when George was a little boy, she was forced to rear this family without a husband's help. Perhaps the responsibility that fell on George after his father's death may have helped to develop his character. At all events, there are many stories about his boyhood in which he seems far older than his years. Letters and history both tell us of his thoughtfulness, his methodical habits, and his great physical strength. Before he was in his teens, he had become the acknowledged leader of the boys in his neighborhood, and he was fond of engaging with them in various athletic games. He also formed a military company of the little negroes on the family estate and drilled them keenly, actually making something like a military show with the barefooted, ragged pickaninnies, with their rolling eyes and woolly heads. Like all other young Virginians, he was accustomed to riding from his infancy, and before he was 10 years old, there were few horses that he could not bridle and master. But we cannot go into stories of George's boyhood, of the time when he cut down the cherry tree and faced his father's wrath rather than tell a lie, or the time when he accidentally killed a high-spirited horse when breaking it to the bridle. He finished his schooling when he was 16 years old and would have gone into the British Navy if his mother had consented. She did not, however, so George studied surveying and was soon earning considerable sums from this occupation. He made an excellent surveyor, and his skillful work and unusual character soon attracted general attention. He was well versed in military tactics also, and was made a major in the Virginia militia before he was 20. This gave added zest for his military studies, and he set to work to learn strategy under a fierce old Dutch army officer named Jacob van Brom. Together they studied maps and fought out battles with pins and bits of wood until far into the night. George was also busied with the care of the Washington estate at Mount Vernon, which was left to him on the death of his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, in 1752. Mount Vernon carried with it about 500 slaves and dependents, and the young man had his time fully occupied in riding over its broad acres and managing its affairs. When George was 21 years old, a difficult task was assigned to him that not only proved that he had really entered the estate of manhood, but also that he was trusted beyond his years. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sent him on a dangerous trip into the wilderness to warn off the French from English ground and to gain the friendship of the wild Indians that lived there. The race for land between the French and English settlers was growing keener and more bitter every day, and both countries claimed the land that lay between the Allegheny and the Mississippi rivers. Finally, the governor of Virginia picked young Washington to go to Venango and warn the French that they were trespassing, and also to make ceremonial visits to the Indians to ensure their friendship to the English in case of war with the French. To succeed would require shrewdness, good sense, courage, and physical strength, for a long journey through virgin forests would have to be made and many dangers encountered. Washington took with him a guide and pioneer named Christopher Gist, and Jacob Van Brem went also to act as interpreter. The journey over 600 miles of desolate wilderness, across swollen streams, through forest, swamp, and over rugged mountain, was performed so speedily that it would be hard for strong men to duplicate it today, traveling over good roads. Washington sat beside the council fires of the Indians and delivered the governor's message to the French. He also noted the best points for fortifications against the encroaching French and reported them on his return. The journey had been a complete success, and since others had tried it and failed, Washington's fame was established throughout Virginia. The French had received him with sly courtesy, and sought to ply his company with wine and brandy rather than to come to any agreement with him. It was plain that they meant mischief, and Governor Dinwiddie decided to send a force of soldiers to build a fort at the juncture between the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers, one of the places that Washington had noted down for its good strategic qualities. Colonel Joshua Fry was placed in command of about 300 troops, and Washington was sent with him as his lieutenant. On the march, Colonel Fry died, and Washington was left in sole command of the troops. Spies and Indian scouts in the employ of the French had reported the expedition, and the French had promptly marched against the Virginian soldiers with greatly superior numbers. Washington got news of this act on their part and hastily threw up fortifications on a plain called Great Meadows. He called his stronghold Fort Necessity. The French soon came up and surrounded the fort, and the bark of the rifles re-echoed through the woods and from the hills. Washington and his men fought with the utmost bravery, but when he saw that the struggle was hopeless and that they would all be killed or captured if the fight continued, he made terms with the French, allowing his men to retire with all their arms and equipment, on condition that they did not make any further attempt to occupy the country for a stipulated time. The French success was not the fault of Washington, who displayed great coolness and secured the maximum advantage for himself and his men. He was warmly commended by the governor for his action in this fight, and had a higher reputation than ever among all who knew the circumstances. Soon after this, Washington engaged in another expedition that was far more disastrous. The English government put Major General Edward Braddock in command of a force of English regular soldiers to gain control of the disputed Ohio Valley, and Washington was appointed as aide on General Braddock's staff. Braddock, in his way, was a good soldier, a hard-bitten, dyed-in-the-wool, regular army officer with a great contempt for the Virginia militia and an overconfident belief that the British soldier was invincible. He believed absolutely that the methods of war that were used on European battlefields would overwhelm anything in America, and he liked to see his redcoats, with their boots polished and their buttons furbished, marching in solid platoon formation, turning and wheeling with mathematical regularity of a machine. His men were drilled and disciplined until they were automatons, for Braddock was a martinet. Their ranks ran true, their equipment was in the pink of soldierly condition, the sunlight glittered from their bayonets, you could see your face in their leather accoutrements, and Braddock proudly marched them into the American woods as though they were parading on the Strand in London. When Washington warned him of the dangers of ambush, urging that an advance guard and scouts be thrown out, Braddock turned scornfully away, believing that a volley or two from his brave regulars would soon drive off any foes that might fall upon him, and he said bluntly that when he desired advice from his subordinates he would ask for it. As his men were marching in close formation, their red coats blazing against the dark green of the forest, shifting figures were seen in the trees ahead. A French officer suddenly appeared, cheering them on to the attack, and with shouts and yells an unseen enemy shot down the Britishers from the protection of fallen trees, from behind rocks and stumps, and from the concealment of forest branches. The redcoats fell by scores and were thrown into hopeless confusion. They were not used to fighting a hidden foe, and were appalled by the death in their midst as well as by the wild cries and war whoops that echoed from the forest. Braddock, waving his sword, ordered his platoons to wheel and advance in solid formation into the woods, and the platoons were wiped out like sheep in a slaughter pit as they tried to obey the hopeless order. But the despised Virginia militia, experienced in Indian fighting, spread out in open order at the head of the column and kept the enemy in check, while Braddock with hopeless bravery attempted to rally his men. It was in vain. The dismal cries and yells continued. The bullets sang overhead like a swarm of wasps. British officers dropped at the shots of invisible sharpshooters who picked them off easily on account of their conspicuous uniforms. Braddock himself, as brave a man as ever lived, had 4 horses killed under him and then received a mortal wound. Washington, whose advice had been laughed at, took command of the Virginians and covered the headlong rout of the British regulars, who threw away their rifles and ran blindly into the woods. How Washington escaped alive is nothing less than a miracle. Like Braddock, he had several horses killed under him, and 4 bullets pierced his uniform. He seemed everywhere at once and showed the most conspicuous bravery, but all he could do was to save the lives of the flying Britishers. With whoops of victory, the Indians scalped the wounded, dressed themselves in the red coats of the slain, and showed their hideous painted faces beneath the cocked hats of British officers. And the French, who held the fort that Braddock had intended to capture, fired their cannon in rejoicing at a victory that forever killed the prestige of British arms in the New World. For hitherto the British soldier had been thought invincible, and this exhibition of crass stupidity and bungling gave the colonials a different opinion of British arms. The British were brave, it is true, but they could not adjust themselves to meet the enemy on their own ground, and in all history the Briton has shown himself clumsy in the guerrilla warfare of the type that won the Revolution for the Americans. A few years after this tragic affair, Washington married Martha Parke Custis, a young widow with 2 children. Washington's love affair with Martha Custis was not the first in his life. He had paid attention to other young beauties and had shown himself a true Virginian in his hearty appreciation of the ladies. With his marriage, there commenced the home life at Mount Vernon that has become so famous in history, and the hospitality for which George and Martha Washington have ever been famous. Washington was fond of the good things of life, and his great house at Mount Vernon was filled with visitors, with whom he hunted and passed his leisure hours in many delightful ways. But his eye for business was no less keen on account of his pleasures, and eventually he came to be looked on as the leading man in the affairs of the colony. His commanding appearance, his wonderful self-control, and his military prestige, coupled with the dignity and the gravity of his manner, made him as prominent among men as he had been among boys. The attitude toward provincials that brought about Braddock's fatal error because he could not listen to advice was destined now to bring to England the loss of her valuable colonies in America. The English looked down on the Americans and patronized them because they did not understand them. They regarded the American colonies too much in the light of a supply house to enrich the crown and the mother country, and too little as the home of a brave and self-reliant people who came of the most sterling English stock themselves. The colonists bitterly resented the unjust laws that compelled them to ship their produce to British ports and to engage in no form of industry that might cripple British enterprise. And when the British government imposed taxes on the colonists that were not imposed on British subjects in England, indignation rose to white heat, and riots and hot speeches broke out everywhere, particularly in New England. The Stamp Act, which compelled the colonists to transact all their legal business on paper bearing the stamp of the British government and sold only by British agents, awoke the wrath of Virginia as well as of New England. The cry of "No taxation without representation" rang from Georgia to Massachusetts. The oratory of Patrick Henry added fuel to the righteous indignation in every American's breast, and when the British, in response to public feeling, removed all unwarranted taxes except one, the tax on tea, a party of young men dressed as Indians sacked the cargo of a British vessel in Boston and poured the chests of tea into the harbor. Parliament retaliated. Penalties were imposed on Massachusetts. The Virginian House of Burgesses was forbidden to meet by the King's order, and meeting in spite of this order, it called for a general congress of all the colonies to decide what measures were to be taken to defend the rights of the American provinces. Washington, as one of Virginia's leading men, naturally was among those who represented the colony at this congress, which met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. He was listened to with respect and attention, and was considered to have the sanest viewpoint and the widest fund of information of any delegate there. The question of armed revolt against England was still in the background, but Washington was in favor of a resort to arms only after all other measures had failed, and as a last resort. He was ready and willing to fight if fighting must come, however, and we have his statement when he heard of how the people of Boston were laboring under unjust British measures. "I will raise 1,000 men," said Washington, "subsist them at my own expense, and march with them at their head for the relief of Boston." At last it was seen that no other way to escape slavery existed than to fight, and Washington was one of the first to devote his life and fortune to the revolutionary cause. When the American Congress met on June 15, 1775, Washington was chosen as commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army. The flame of revolution had run through the colonies. The British had killed and been killed by militiamen at Lexington, and had fallen back before the hail of lead from the squirrel rifles of angry farmers at the bridge at Concord. From stone walls, fences, trees, and haylofts, the Americans had picked off the British redcoats as they retreated back to Boston, and had proved themselves to be foemen that could not be despised. The battles of Bunker Hill and Dorchester Heights followed. Bloody war was begun. No better man for command of the American army could possibly have been chosen than Washington, and very probably no other could have brought the Revolution to a successful end. His firm and great nature were known to all, and with this he possessed great military skill and a thorough knowledge of the country where he would have to fight. But his heart may well have sunk when he took command, for no worse scene of confusion and inefficiency can be imagined than that of the American army when it was first mustered together. Washington, on July 3rd, 1775, took command at Cambridge, Massachusetts, of about 16,000 raw recruits, badly fed, badly quartered, with no uniforms to speak of, little equipment, and a rebellious disregard of all discipline that was increased by the fact that they were fighting against the unjust discipline of the British government. The American forces had no organization, and the work fell upon Washington as commander-in-chief not only of fighting an enemy, far superior in numbers and composed of well-disciplined and well-equipped veterans, but of organizing his own army almost in the course of battle, and manufacturing the material for victory after the gage had been cast and the conflict entered. But the resolute will and the firm hand brought order out of chaos, and the British were astonished to see the effectiveness of the rough and ready troops that opposed them. The city of Boston was besieged so firmly that the British at last decided to evacuate the town, sailing away in their warships headed for New York. Washington, by forced marches, attempted to reach that city first and foil their attempt to land there, but the American army was not large enough for this design, and American and British forces faced each other on Long Island, where a battle was fought near the present site of Brooklyn on August 27, 1776. The country was now prepared for a grim struggle, and the temper of the revolutionists was shown by the glorious Declaration of Independence, which was made on July 4th of that year. But spirit and determination are not proof against cold steel and solid ranks of veteran soldiers, and Washington's little army was beaten by the British in the Battle of Long Island, sustaining heavy losses in dead and wounded. The Americans retreated and then halted, and when night fell, only a short distance separated the two armies. The situation of the Americans was critical in the extreme, and it was absolutely necessary to cross the East River before the sadly harried and beaten ranks of the Patriot army were attacked again by the victorious Britishers. Almost within the sound of the voices of the enemy, Washington succeeded in drawing away his army and carrying them in boats to New York City without a single foe suspecting his design. The British followed, and there was fighting on Manhattan Island. Slowly the little force of patriots was driven back, now sadly decreased in numbers, for the ending of enlistments as well as defeat were playing havoc with Washington's forces. In November he was obliged to cross the Hudson River and retreat into New Jersey with only 6,000 men left to him, and still later, with a force still smaller and the British close on his heels, he crossed the Delaware River and sought refuge in Pennsylvania. By this time the British had gained such successes and the Americans had undergone so many reverses and privations that it seemed as if no power on earth could bring victory to the American arms. The British found they could not cross into Pennsylvania, for Washington had taken care to remove all the boats to the other side of the Delaware River. They temporarily gave over the pursuit of the Americans, whom they thought were hopelessly beaten, and went into winter quarters where they enjoyed themselves immensely and kept an easy and comfortable camp. But Washington was already planning a raid against the German mercenaries called Hessians, who were stationed in the town of Trenton. He planned to return across the Delaware and fall upon the Hessians by night in a surprise attack. He tried to secure the cooperation of General Gates, one of his subordinates, but Gates feigned sickness and went to Philadelphia to attempt Washington's overthrow on the day before Washington's attack was to be launched. Disaffection among his generals was now added to Washington's other troubles, and Gates, in jealousy, was planning to go before Congress and secure an independent command for himself. On Christmas night, 1776, the little American army embarked on its perilous venture and prepared to cross the Delaware River, which was now so full of floating ice as to make the passage of boats dangerous in the extreme. It was black as pitch and a high wind blew, as the American soldiers with aching backs toiled at the oars with the poles, and so cold that men froze to death. Hours were consumed in the passage, and by the time the Americans were in position to attack, day was breaking. Nevertheless, the project seemed likely to succeed. The Hessians were off their guard and were sleeping soundly. Scattered shots rang out and were succeeded by the rattle of musketry as the Americans, yelling like Indians, charged upon the silent town. The Hessian bugles blew to arms, and the dazed soldiers rushed out of their billets, but instead of rallying and fighting Washington, they fled toward Princeton, leaving more than 1,000 prisoners in Washington's hands, as well as large numbers of killed and wounded. Lord Cornwallis was hurriedly sent to oppose Washington and went to bed at Trenton within sight of the American camp fires. The British general was confident of success and boasted that he would certainly bag the fox in the morning. That night, however, Washington silently withdrew his army as he had done on Long Island, and in a series of brilliant maneuvers defeated the British again not far from Princeton. His skill and generalship were so great that, with a half-starved and discouraged remnant of a defeated army, he twice defeated the flower of the British force and brought new hope and strength to the struggling colonies. He had done more than this, for his military success was now closely watched in Europe, and Cornwallis was soon so hard pressed that he withdrew his troops to New York, and in the end the Americans once more had complete control of the state of New Jersey. In the year 1778, and largely due to the great qualities of Benjamin Franklin, who was one of America's commissioners in France, a treaty was signed with the French providing that if France went to war with England, there should be an alliance between the French and American governments, and neither should cease fighting without the permission of the other. Moreover, that both were to continue the struggle until the independence of the United States of America was gained. This treaty was not only due to Washington's successes, but to a victory won by General Gates against General Burgoyne, who, after the Battle of Saratoga, was forced to withdraw his army from the conflict and place himself and his officers on parole to bear arms no more against America. But there followed a renewal of the bitterness of defeat, for the Americans were beaten at Brandywine, the British took Philadelphia, and another reverse befell the American arms at Germantown. It seemed that in spite of the former American successes in the French treaty, the British would be victorious after all, for the winter had been a terrible one, and the worn American army was almost destitute of food and clothing. Washington had camped at a place called Valley Forge, which has since become symbolic of hardship and suffering. It is said that detachments of American soldiers could be traced by the blood in the snow from their wounded and bare feet, for there were no shoes to clothe them, and there was very little food or fuel. And in addition to the physical hardship and the gloom of failure, Washington had to contend with a conspiracy that was directed against him by some of his most trusted officers who desired to place General Gates in supreme command of the American army. This conspiracy was called the Conway Cabal, because the chief plotter was an Irishman named General Thomas Conway, but the result of this base attempt was added power and glory for Washington, for Congress was fortunately unaffected by the representations that were made. In the following year, 1778, in spite of that terrible winter, the fighting opened with the Americans in better condition than previously, and with their numbers strengthened with new recruits that Congress had secured for them. The American cause had also been strengthened by the voluntary services of a number of foreign officers who energetically drilled the American recruits and taught the Revolutionary Army the science of war as it was fought by the greatest military countries. Among these men was the Marquis de Lafayette, a gallant young French nobleman, and also Baron de Kalb and von Steuben. Washington gradually drew nearer to New York, from which he had been driven so soon after the Battle of Long Island, and that winter he camped in the highlands of the Hudson and established his troops so as to defend New England from any offensive campaign the British might take, and for a year he contented himself with playing a waiting game, keeping a firm grip on the Hudson highlands and strengthening his army as greatly as possible. Victory now was near, for the French came actively into the war to the succor of the Americans. The French king, Louis XVI, sent Count Rochambeau to command an expedition in America, and the year 1781 saw the trained and seasoned soldiers of France fighting side by side with the American troops. In this year too great advantage was given to Washington's troops by the fact that a large French fleet under the Count de Grasse compelled the British vessels to keep to the ports, while Washington with the French laid siege to Yorktown, which was held by Lord Cornwallis. Washington himself fired the first cannon as the siege began, and a whirlwind of iron and red-hot shot was poured upon the British works and shipping from French and American guns. The British resisted stubbornly, but they were cut off and their position was hopeless, and on October 19th, with the American and French troops drawn up to receive them, the British marched out and surrendered. This was really the end of the war. The news that Cornwallis and at least 16,000 men had been captured was received with wild rejoicing all through the former colonies, and with amazement and gloom in England, where it was plainly seen that the valuable colonies were lost forever. In the month of November, 1783, the British left New York never to return. After the signing of the peace treaty at Paris in January of the same year, the war was over, the patriots had conquered, and a new and mighty nation was in its infancy. At this time it would without doubt have been easy for Washington to make himself the head of the new country and even to have become its king and permanent ruler. The army worshipped the ground he walked on, and he actually received a letter from one of his officers in which it was suggested that he be named as king of the new state. But Washington, with his characteristic greatness, refused to advance his own fortunes at the expense of the liberty of his countrymen, and he wrote an angry letter indignantly rejecting any such title or position. declaring that nothing in his long and trying service had justified his fellows in regarding him as an ambitious self-seeker. His work was done, or so he considered it, and he proposed to return to private life, and in Fraunce's Tavern in New York, the great commander bade farewell to the officers who so gallantly served him and had been his brothers in arms on so many hard-fought fields. It is said that on this occasion Washington's customary self-control almost deserted him as he spoke his words of parting to his fellow officers. "With a heart full of love and gratitude," said he, "I now take leave of you, most devoutly wishing that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable. I cannot come to each of you to take my leave," he continued, "but shall be obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand." But Washington's work was not over. He had counseled all the governors of the separate states to form a federal government as quickly as possible, and while he had resigned as head of the army, he continued as a private citizen to watch public matters with the utmost care and attention. In 1787 Washington presided over the famous convention which met in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution of the United States, and largely in accordance with his ideas, which strongly influenced the minds of all those present, the government of the United States was formed. The perfection of the form of government, as entered into by so many separate and widely different states, seemed to Washington, as he afterward said in a letter to Lafayette, little short of a miracle. It remained for the new country to choose its first president. Washington was elected without a dissenting voice and took the reins of government into his hands on April 30th, 1789. He did not desire the presidency and would have greatly preferred to remain quietly at Mount Vernon, an honest man on his own farm, engaged in his private affairs, but he felt that it was his duty to answer so spontaneous and general a call from his fellow citizens, and in the office of chief executive he showed the same firm and wise spirit that had distinguished him as commander of the army. His cabinet contained the most famous and brilliant men of the day, and the people throughout the country felt themselves safe with such a president at the helm. When his administration ended, he was called upon to take a second term, and in this he had great difficulty in keeping the new republic out of the turmoil of European politics. France had by this time thrown off her rulers, organized a revolution, and gone to war with England, and Washington was called on from every part of the country to go to the aid of his former ally against the former foe. He saw, however, that war at that time would be fatal for America, and might well result in the loss of all that had been gained in the bitter years of the Revolution. He firmly refused to enter the war, although his decision cost him much of his popularity. A commercial treaty was then entered upon with England. While Washington was president, the states of Kentucky and Tennessee were added to the original 13 that formed the Union, and many important financial and legal matters were concluded. With a sure hand, the great patriot guided the new country through the dangers that beset it, and at times threatened to swallow it whole, and in the year 1797 he turned over to John Adams, who was to succeed him in the presidential chair, a welded nation, destined for a mighty future. For the next 3 years Washington's life at Mount Vernon was quiet and happy, and he busied himself in the affairs of his estate, and in the dignified hospitality for which he and Martha Washington were so justly renowned. On December 12, 1799, after a horseback ride through the snow, he became ill with laryngitis, and 2 days later he breathed his last. Throughout the United States he was mourned as a father. Indeed, he had already gained the title of the Father of his Country, and it was by the father of a famous general who was destined to lead the Southern cause in the Civil War some 60 years later that Washington was said to be first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, a phrase that has since become familiar to hundreds of millions of people throughout the world, and has so aptly described America's mightiest son. End of chapter 18. Recording by Timothy Luke.